Welcome, everybody. My name is Ishai Rosenzweig. I will not talk. I just want to say how excited I am to see you all here, and that you've made it here, and that you've made it in the most hottest day, I think, in the last, century? Okay. And to remind those of us who participate in the workshop that we are meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. or a few minutes before 9 at the Zimbalista Beit Midrash Lehrhaus, and to invite Professor Adam Afterman, the head of the Department of Jewish Philosophy and Talmud, to open this session.
Thank you, Shai. Good evening. On behalf of Dean Leo Corey, that I apologize that he couldn't come here tonight, and the entire community of Tel Aviv University, I would like to express my warm welcome to our dear guests, faculty, and graduate students visiting from Princeton University. It is indeed a great pleasure and honor for me personally to represent the department here on this occasion of the official opening of the first Princeton-Tel Aviv joint workshop dedicated to the topic of Judaism and Christianity in late antiquity. Let me first express my most sincere thanks to the local organizers, in particular to my colleague, Professor Ishai Rosenzweig, for conceiving, imagining, and then realizing this joint project. Ishai was supported by Professor Vered Noam and our staff at the Department of Jewish Philosophy and Talmud, including Ruti, our office manager, and especially Anat Aviram, our devoted secretary, who for great dedication and care allowed this exciting occasion to become real. And we all know that none of this would be possible without her. And I just want to thank her personally again. I would also like to thank our Princeton colleagues, Professor Muli Vidas, for his engagement and commitment to this partnership and workshop from day one, and to Martha, the Director of Jewish Studies at Princeton University, for an enthusiastic partnership and kind support she provided. I would also like to express our gratitude to our Dean, once again, Professor Leo Corey, for his leadership and support, Professor Tamar Sovran, Chair of the School of Jewish Studies, for ongoing support, and Tau Vice President, Professor Ranan Ryan, for his generous support and encouragement. So we had many partners and people involved that we're very proud to mention tonight. We also have a few partners from inside Tel Aviv. Professor Dan Laor, the head of Chimbalista Jewish Heritage Center, will be visiting tomorrow. And Dr. Scott Uri, the director of Tau's Stephen Roth Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism and Racism. Some of you might know our department has undergone some major developments over the last 2 years. And we are especially proud now that we have returned to our original status as an independent department to host this event tonight. You know, we used to be a program inside a larger mega department for Hebrew culture, and now we are finally free and returned to our original status as a Department of Jewish Philosophy. I think so. I think Noam is actually quite happy with our status. But we're all part of a broader body of the School of Jewish Studies, and I think there's something very unique. I'll just say a few words very briefly about what's unique and special about our school and about our department that I hope will come be reflected in this workshop. So the study of Jewish philosophy at our department is well known for its broad and intercontextualized way we approach the Jewish tradition, and for its balanced study of text and theory, especially in light of our tradition. So this is exactly why this workshop, dedicated to the study of Judaism and Christianity in late antiquity, is a natural outgrowth of our house of study. So we are very excited about this cooperation, especially since our distinguished and committed partners, no doubt, share our passion. And everybody knows Ishai's passion for the study and research of Jewish texts. We're all looking forward to continuing studying together and expanding our relationship in future years. So I'd finally like to invite Professor Jeremy Cohen to introduce our distinguished speaker of tonight. Please.
Good evening. It's a great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker this evening. Professor Martha Himmelfarb is the William Danforth Professor of Religion at Princeton University, where she also is director of the program of Jewish Studies. Most meaningful for me is that she's a close personal friend of just about half a century, and it's an especial pleasure for that reason for me to be able to welcome her this evening at a session like this one. She is one of the leading scholars of the day in the study of ancient Judaism and its contacts with Christianity. She has authored 6 books, one of which has been translated even into Japanese. She has edited several more, written several dozen articles, and I think it's much more fitting that we listen to her rather than listen to me tell you about her. So without further ado, I would ask her to come and offer her remarks on Armilos and Antichrist, Polemical Eschatology in Late Antiquity. Professor Himmelfarb.
Well, I want to start by echoing the thanks, and I'm not going to try to mention everyone because I'm sure I'll forget somebody, and that's always embarrassing, but I especially want to mention Muli and Ishai for their organizational efforts. Thank you very much. And Anat Aviram and Baru Saul at the Princeton end for also contributing at the very kind of nitty-gritty level of making things happen. I did forget a page. Well, that would have been disastrous. Thank you. And thanks to Jeremy. And I was trying to calculate how long we've been friends, and it is a little bit sobering to realize how long it's been. But it's also kind of nice to be able to say that about someone who's not a relative, that you've known them and been friends with them for that long. So please let me know if you can't hear me back there. I'm not sure how well this is working. If it's not, I'll just try to speak louder. You can't hear. Okay. You can hear. You can hear. Excellent. Okay. Anyone familiar with the book of Daniel in the Tanakh or the book of Revelation in the New Testament knows that these apocalypses imagine imperial powers receiving their just deserts in the course of the unfolding of the events of the eschaton. Thus, in Daniel's vision of the 4 beasts from the sea, the 4th beast, which represents the Hellenistic empires, is slain and burned as Daniel looks on, presumably together with its little horn, which represents Antiochus IV, the Seleucid king under whose rule this chapter of Daniel was composed. The imperial enemy of the book of Revelation is Rome, and Revelation offers an elaborate description of the destruction of the harlot who represents Rome, or in Revelation's coded language, Babylon, and the scarlet beast on which she is seated, likely Nero, the most evil of emperors. One might call this eschatology polemical, but I think it is better characterized as compensatory or hostile. If Seleucid or Roman authorities had read Daniel or Revelation, their reaction would likely have taken the form of physical punishment. They would not have responded with their own vision of eschatological judgment in which the Jews or followers of Jesus suffered punishment. In late antiquity, however, the imperial enemy of the Jews was a Christian empire, which meant that the enemy had embraced Jewish scripture and many aspects of Jewish tradition. With such an enemy, eschatology could be used to respond to and undermine specific aspects of the enemy's sacred narrative. This type of eschatology, which seems to me more properly termed polemical, is my subject this evening. Now let me turn from the subtitle of my lecture to one of its title characters, Armilos, the great villain of late antique Jewish eschatological literature. But first, I need to introduce Sefer Zerubbabel, a short Hebrew work from the early 7th century CE, where Armilos' story is first recounted, a work that had a major impact on later Jewish messianism and eschatology. Sefer Zerubbabel presents itself as a revelation by the angel Michael or Metatron, he quite confusingly uses both names in the course of the work, to Zerubbabel, the first-person narrator, who is explicitly identified as the late 6th century BCE Jewish governor of Judea by that name, was appointed by the Persians. The First Persian Empire, which brought an end to the Babylonian Empire that had destroyed the First Temple in 586 BCE, permitted the exiled Judeans and their descendants to return to their homeland and build a new temple, completed in 515 BCE, during Zerubbabel's term in office. It is presumably his association with this great moment of restoration that made Zerubbabel an appropriate recipient of revelation for a work concerning the final restoration of the temple and the Jewish people. The attribution has the added advantage of conferring the authority of antiquity on its prophecy of the events of the last days. Furthermore, the Persian Empire, though a later one, ruled by the Sasanian dynasty, plays a significant role in Sefer Zerubbabel. The narrative of Sefer Zerubbabel reflects the wars between the Persians and the Byzantine Empire in the first 3 decades of the 7th century, especially their battles over Jerusalem, which the Persians took from the Byzantines in 614 and ruled for more than a decade before the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius won it back. For Sefer Zerubbabel, these wars, and particularly the wresting of Jerusalem from Christian control, followed by the return of Christian rule, are the beginning of the events of the eschaton. So I think it was very exciting that the Christians lost Jerusalem, and then when they got it back, that could be seen as yet another sign that the end was very near. But Sefer Zerubbabel shows no awareness of the dramatic events of the 4th decade of the 7th century, in which a new imperial power, the Muslims, conquered the eastern part of the Byzantine Empire, including Jerusalem, and went on to rule there more or less uninterrupted until very recently, at least relatively speaking. Thus, it is virtually certain that Sefer Zerubbabel was composed before the Muslim conquest, though likely very shortly before. Sefer Zerubbabel's eschatological scenario involves a rather extensive cast. To begin with, it offers not one Messiah, but 2, a Davidic Messiah named Menachem ben Amiel, and a Messiah descended from Joseph named Nehemiah ben Hushiel. In other places, I always try to anglicize the names, and I'm calling him Zerubbabel. I usually call him Zerubbabel. So you can see I'm not quite sure how to do it, so I apologize for my inconsistency here. Okay. Menachem awaits the time of the end, imprisoned in Rome, suffering and despised. The language in which he is described is drawn from Isaiah 53, one of the poems about the suffering servant. Nehemiah presides for 40 years over the gathering of the Jewish people in Jerusalem and the restoration of sacrifice. But when Armilos and his forces attack Jerusalem, Nehemiah is killed by Armilos. He does not stay dead, however, since Menachem and Elijah the prophet bring him back to life in the course of their defeat of the forces of evil. Thus, Sefer Zerubbabel's 2 messiahs divide between them some crucial aspects of the career of the Christian Messiah. Menachem suffers but does not die. Nehemiah does not suffer, but he does die and is resurrected. Now, I think the most memorable messianic hero of Sefer Zerubbabel is actually a heroine. This is Hephzibah, the mother of Menachem ben Amiel. But this mother of a Messiah does not engage in any typically maternal behavior. She is a warrior who defeats 2 kings with her miraculous staff before Nehemiah comes to power, and protects Jerusalem, though not entirely successfully, when it is under attack first by the Persians and then by Armilos and his forces. Hephzibah's role is quite unexpected from the point of view of Jewish antecedents. I mean, there are some Jewish antecedents for the idea of a mother of the Messiah, but nothing quite like this. Certainly nothing like this. Her military prowess becomes less surprising in light of contemporary Byzantine understanding, contemporary with Sefer Zerubbabel, of the Virgin Mary as the patron and protector of Constantinople. Now, in my view, there can be little doubt that these heroes are shaped to a very considerable degree by Sefer Zerubbabel's interest in the Christian messianic narrative. It's possible, perhaps, to imagine a Messiah modeled on the suffering servant in a Jewish work written after the rise of Christianity, apart from the impact of the Christian messianic narrative. I mean, there is earlier Jewish material, there's the Tanakh to draw on. possible, and some scholars have argued for pre- or non-Christian antecedents to the dying Messiah descended from Joseph, though I must say I don't find their arguments convincing. But as these figures appear in Sefer Zerubbabel, it seems to me there can be very little doubt about the impact of Christianity on their depiction. Furthermore, while rabbinic literature contains traditions about a suffering Messiah descended from David, a dying Messiah descended from Joseph, and the mother of a Davidic Messiah named Menachem, though she's not, there's no hint that she's a warrior, I do not believe that Sefer Zerubbabel's picture is drawn from rabbinic tradition. Rather, I've argued this at some length, Sefer Zerubbabel attests the same popular messianic traditions that made their way into rabbinic literature, traditions that, in my view, already show the impact of Christian messianism. The rabbis appear somewhat uncomfortable with these traditions and attempt to defuse their eschatological expectations. Sefer Zerubbabel, on the other hand, embraces them and develops them further. The relationship of Sefer Zerubbabel's heroes to the foundational Christian narrative and to Byzantine culture surely reflects the attraction Christian narrative and culture held for Sefer Zerubbabel's author or authors, and for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to talk about author from now on. It is certainly not an authored work in our standard modern sense, you won't be surprised to hear. So it reflects the attraction Christian narrative and culture held for Sefer Zerubbabel's author, together with a certain amount of anxiety that it produced. The same is true, it seems to me, for the figure of Armilos, though here the author appears to have felt both attraction and repulsion. Armilos is not the only enemy of the forces of good in Sefer Zerubbabel. His attack on Jerusalem follows that of Shiroi, king of Persia, that's Sefer Zerubbabel's name for him, who is probably to be identified with the Sasanian king Kavad II, Siroes in Greek and Latin sources, who ruled briefly from 628 to 629. And Sefer Zerubbabel's eschatological scenario involves a number of other presumably invented kings of real places. And Armilos is not even the only mythic enemy, since Gog and Magog make a brief appearance as the events of the eschaton are winding down. But Armilos is the arch enemy, and Sefer Zerubbabel devotes a great deal of attention to him, including providing him with a birth story. The revealing angel introduces Zerubbabel, and thus also readers of Sefer Zerubbabel, to Armilos by taking Zerubbabel to what the narrative calls a house of disgrace and scorn, which is presumably a church, in Rome, which for Sefer Zerubbabel's first readers would have meant Constantinople, the new Rome, capital of the Byzantine Empire, which is for them the Roman Empire. And I'm going to read a little passage from Sefer Zerubbabel. He showed me, this is Zerubbabel speaking, he, the angel, showed me a marble stone in the shape of a virgin, and its appearance and form were most lovely and beautiful to behold. This stone is the wife of Belial. Satan will come and lie with it, and a son named Armilos will come forth from it. Now, this is my translation, and I'm sure you all realize it's my choice to translate it rather than her of the statue, since Hebrew does not have a neuter gender, since even common nouns are gendered, and since Evan, stone, is feminine, I could have translated her. I'm really trying to stress the fact that it's a stone there. Okay, this account of Armilos' ancestry sounds to me like a parody, and quite a nasty one, of the virgin birth. Where Jesus is the son of a virgin and has God as his father, Armilos is the son of a statue of a virgin, a statue that later in the text will be worshipped as an idol, and has Satan as his father. And while Jesus is conceived without sexual relations, the birth of Armilos results from Satan's lying with the beautiful statue. The statue may represent a virgin, but it is not really one. Now, if you are puzzled by the idea of sex with a stone, it's perhaps worth noting that the Greeks told a number of stories about men who attempted to have sexual relations with statues. Probably the one most relevant to Sefer Zerubbabel is the story of the man so overcome by the beauty of the statue of Aphrodite at Knidos that he first assaulted the statue and then threw himself into the sea. The church father Clement of Alexandria, who was active at the turn of the 2nd to the 3rd century, cites this story and others like it as evidence for the folly of idolatry. It's not impossible that such stories were known to the author of Sefer Zerubbabel, who surely would have agreed with Clement about their significance. I should say that not all scholars are convinced that Sefer Zerubbabel's account of the birth of Armilos should be read as an attack on the story of the virgin birth. Their most important objection, in my view, is that no Byzantine church in the early 7th century would have contained a statue of the Virgin, since at this time Byzantine Christians depicted Christ, the Virgin, the saints in two-dimensional images, paintings, mosaics, even low reliefs, but they did not make use of sculpture in the round for cultic purposes. Now, in response to this objection, I would suggest that Sefer Zerubbabel does not make the distinction that Byzantine Christians made between acceptable forms of representation and unacceptable. It is possible that the author of Sefer Zerubbabel had never seen the inside of a church and assumed that it contained sculpture in the round. But I think it's more likely that he knew quite well what church art looked like, but wanted to insist in any case that Christian images constitute idolatry. There's some uncertainty about the degree of the author of Sefer Zerubbabel's familiarity with Christian art and Christian practice, but I don't think there can be any uncertainty about his attitude toward Christian veneration of the Virgin, especially as expressed in an episode at the end of Sefer Zerubbabel, in which Armilos takes the statue from the church and sets it up for the nations to worship with incense and libations. The importance that Sefer Zerubbabel attributes to the statue is a sort of mirror image of Sefer Zerubbabel's picture of Hephzibah. While the depiction of the mother of the Messiah as a warrior reflects an important aspect of contemporary Christian veneration of the Virgin, it's one that plays down her feminine characteristics. Unlike the statue, Hephzibah is never described as beautiful. Perhaps the avoidance of feminine characteristics and indeed of maternal behavior on the part of the mother of the Davidic Messiah helped reduce any anxiety that the author of Sefer Zerubbabel felt about his rather daring innovation. Furthermore, Sefer Zerubbabel's parody is not only an attack on the Christian story of Jesus' birth, but also on the Roman, that is Byzantine, Empire, since readers would likely have recognized the name Armilos as derived from Romulus, the eponymous legendary founder of the city of Rome. This name for the eschatological enemy does not seem to have been original to Sefer Zerubbabel. It shows up also in Sefer Eliyahu, or echo of it we'll see, the other Hebrew apocalyptic work to come down to us from the early 7th century, which offers Harmilat and Tarmilah, and the vocalization is guesswork, but I'm guessing, as possible names for the king of the last days, and they do sound to me as if they are some kind of distortion, which, who knows when that emerged, whether in transmission or at the beginning stage of the name Armilos. Ultimately, it's interesting, Sefer Eliyahu settles on the name Hachsara, again, I'm guessing about the vocalization, which sounds more Persian to me than Roman, and the possibility of either a Roman or a Persian king at the end of days presumably reflects the historical reality of the decades of the war, of those decades at the beginning of the 7th century, where the Persian and Byzantine empires were at war, and there was Byzantine control of Jerusalem gave way to Persian, which gave way again to Byzantine. Immediately after the account of the birth of Armilos, the most important manuscript of Sefer Zerubbabel supplies what appears to be a different interpretation of the name. And I'm going to quote that. A son named Armilos will come forth from it, from the stone. He will destroy the people. And in the Hebrew language, and then there's some kind of confusion, and it's already confused, and it goes on. Now, this passage is actually absent from most witnesses, and even as we have it in that in the manuscript I'm quoting from, it's clearly confused as it stands. Israel Levi, the great 20th century, early 20th century editor and translator of Sefer Zerubbabel, who did foundational work on the text, suggested amending Hebrew to Greek and dropping the and, which would give you a son named Armilos will come forth from it. He will destroy the people in the Greek language. So he understood the passage to be suggesting a Greek etymology for Armilos, eremolaos, destroyer of the people. David Berger has noted that this kind of etymology would be parallel to the rabbinic etymology for Bil'am, Bala'am, swallower of the people, and suggested that Bil'am was the typological ancestor of Armilos. Very a brilliant suggestion. I mean, I'm not sure it's right, but it's a brilliant move. Whatever the origin of the name, and the etymology based on Eremolaos could certainly have been superimposed on an already existing name based on Romulus, there can be no doubt that Sefer Zerubbabel, and as we shall see shortly, later Jewish works as well, understand Armilos as the representative of the Roman Empire and Christendom. As I have already noted, Sefer Zerubbabel places considerable emphasis on Armilos' insistence on the worship of his mother. And I'm going to quote from Sefer Zerubbabel again. Armilos will take his mother, the stone from which he was born, out of the house of disgrace of the scorners. From all over the nations will come to worship that stone, offer incense, and pour libations to it. No one will be able to look upon it because of its beauty. Anyone who does not bow down to it will die, suffering like an animal. I mean, there's always kind of like a Gorgon-like aspect to this, I think. But Sefer Zerubbabel also depicts Armilos as engaged in the worship of other divinities. He will worship strange gods. No one will be able to stand before him. Then later, in Rivna, which is Antioch, he will begin to plant the sacred posts, Asherot, of all the nations and to worship their false gods, Baalim, whom God hates on the face of the earth. Furthermore, immediately following his worship of strange gods, Sefer Zerubbabel hints that Armilos expects to be an object of worship himself. Anyone who does not believe in him, he will slay by the sword, and he will slay many of them. Later it reports, all the nations of the world will go astray after him, except for Israel, who will not believe in him. Sefer Zerubbabel does not develop these hints, but we'll see that Armilos' demand that he be recognized as divine is a central theme of some later Jewish works. Sefer Zerubbabel does not recount how Armilos achieves world dominion, though his reign follows the Persian assault on Jerusalem, nor does it offer much detail about his persecution of the Jewish people. The single act of Armilos on which Sefer Zerubbabel focuses is the killing of Nehemiah, the Messiah descended from Joseph, and 16 righteous men with him, who are then mourned for Israel by 41 days. From the depths of despair, Israel cries out to God, and the cries lead to the coming of the Davidic Messiah, Menachem ben Amiel. Sorry, I have a misarranged page here. In the course of his mission, Menachem brings Nehemiah back to life with the help of Elijah and slays Armilos with his breath, in keeping with Isaiah 11's prophecy of the ideal Davidic king. With the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked one. Indeed, this moment is so important to Sefer Zerubbabel that it describes it twice and makes a second account at the end of the work. Sefer Zerubbabel's narrative, then, tells of the downfall of a figure who is at once the embodiment of Rome, that is Byzantium and Christendom, and a sort of anti-Jesus, Antichrist. It tells about his downfall at the hands of a suffering Messiah who resurrects a dead Messiah. It is a story of the triumph of Jews over Christians and Judaism over Christianity. But even at its most polemical, or maybe I shouldn't say even, but Precisely at its most polemical, it is engaged in adaptation of Christian themes. Its story of Armilos shows significant parallels to Christian speculation about the Antichrist derived from the brief prophecy found in 2 Thessalonians, the New Testament letter attributed to Paul. Few scholars today would accept the claim made by Wilhelm Bousset more than a century ago in his important and influential book, The Antichrist Legend, in English translation, for a unified Antichrist narrative with roots in the ancient Near East that Christians took over from Jews and then adapted to their needs. Recent scholarship has tended much more to emphasize the differences among the earlier figures who contributed to Christian ideas about the great eschatological enemy, and to pay attention to the variety of situations in which speculation about the Antichrist responds, not only oppression by foreign rulers, but also inner Christian conflict among proponents of different teachings. Yet despite the diversity of the later Christian evidence, there can be no doubt of the impact of 2 Thessalonians, perhaps inevitably, given its canonical status, though it should be noted that 2 Thessalonians never calls its villain Antichrist, but rather man of lawlessness, son of perdition, or the lawless one. The relevant passage in 2 Thessalonians begins by insisting that the lawless one must come before Christ's second coming, and then I'm going to quote a little bit. He will, and this is quotation, take his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. He will come with, and this is, again, quotation, false signs and wonders, but he will be defeated by the Lord Jesus, who will slay him with the breath of his mouth. Yet, while the mystery of lawlessness is already at work, the lawless one himself has not yet appeared because of one restraining him. Now, the meaning of this claim and the identity of the restrainer have been the subject of enormous scholarly discussion, but I'm not going to address them now because they really aren't so important for our purposes. Well, as you will have already noticed, the most precise parallel between the very brief prophecy of 2 Thessalonians and the much longer narrative of Sefer Zerubbabel is the slaying of the great eschatological enemy by the Messiah, or in the case of Sefer Zerubbabel, the Davidic Messiah, in a way intended to evoke the prophecy of Isaiah 11. Yet it would be hard to argue on the basis of this parallel alone that Sefer Zerubbabel was responding to 2 Thessalonians or later Christian Antichrist speculation based on 2 Thessalonians, since both 2 Thessalonians and Sefer Zerubbabel knew and valued the passage in Isaiah. But though it is certainly not as precise a parallel as the shared picture of the Messiah's breath as instrument of death, 2 Thessalonians' picture of the lawless one in the temple proclaiming himself God finds an echo in Sefer Zerubbabel's hints of Armilos' claim to divinity. There is no temple available in which Armilos can take a seat as the eschaton unfolds in Sefer Zerubbabel. Yet, while Armilos insists on the worship of his mother and is himself said to worship strange gods, as I've already said, Sefer Zerubbabel also indicates that he demands to be treated as a god. As we shall see shortly, later Jewish texts tell a story in which Armilos' claim to be God is crystal clear. Finally, while Sefer Zerubbabel does not report any signs and wonders, false or otherwise, that Armilos performs, later Christian development of this aspect of 2 Thessalonians' passage appears to have had an impact on Sefer Zerubbabel's narrative. Pseudo-Ephraim's Sermon on the End of Time is a Syriac work that reached its final form shortly after the Muslim conquest. After the evil one takes his seat in the temple and proclaims himself God, Pseudo-Ephraim tells us that he goes on to perform many impressive miracles, including deeds particularly associated with Jesus in the Gospels, such as healing the blind, deaf, and mute, though Pseudo-Ephraim also informs us the wonderful acts are not actually miracles, but magic. But despite his magic, there is one wonder the evil one cannot perform: he cannot resurrect the dead. Now, I think this sheds light on Sefer Zerubbabel's account of the way Menachem persuades skeptical Jews that he is indeed the Messiah, son of David, despite his humble appearance. He brings Nehemiah back to life. Sefer Zerubbabel could not have drawn on the sermon of Pseudo-Ephraim itself, which was composed toward the end of the century, but its depiction of the persuasive power of the resurrection of Nehemiah suggests that it is aware of traditions, of Christian traditions, that hold that bringing the dead back to life is a sign of the true Messiah. Now, the most striking aspect of Armilos' biography, according to Sefer Zerubbabel, I think it's clear, is its account of his birth. And on this subject, 2 Thessalonians is entirely silent. But as far back as Irenaeus in the 2nd century, some Christian writers took an interest in the Antichrist genealogy, identifying him as born from the tribe of Dan. The Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius, an extremely influential Syriac apocalypse composed toward the end of the 7th century in response to the Muslim conquest, adds that the Danite mother will be a married woman, presumably in contrast to the virgin mother of the true Christ. The origins of the Danite genealogy of the Antichrist are not clear, though Christian writers certainly find a number of passages from the Tanakh and the Book of Revelation to support it. One recent suggestion is to understand it as a response to Jewish messianic speculation involving the tribe of Dan and perhaps the figure of Samson. This is an interesting suggestion, but I think it's quite speculative. And I should add the Danite genealogy is not the unanimous view of Christian sources, even sources that do provide a genealogy for the Antichrist. The Syriac apocalypse of Daniel makes the Antichrist the son, which seems to be pre-Muslim invasion, makes the Antichrist the son of a woman from the tribe of Levi. To the best of my knowledge, the claim is unique to this text, but it's perhaps worth stating the obvious. Whether he comes from the tribe of Dan or from the tribe of Levi, the Antichrist is in either case a Jew. Now, it's interesting that the Greek Daniel apocalypse from the early 9th century, it's the only Christian work I know that offers a real birth story for the Antichrist, does not provide a Jewish genealogy for him, though I think it probably implies it. It gestures to the by then traditional Danite genealogy by placing the appearance of the Antichrist at the time of a mighty ruler from Judea named Dan. And it is probably implied by the details of the birth narrative and the Antichrist's positive relations with Jews after his appearance. The birth narrative runs as follows. The Antichrist will come forth from the depths and take up residence in a small fish, which will then be caught by 12 fishermen. One of the fishermen, whose name is Judas, will sell the fish for 30 silver pieces. A virgin named Injustice and surnamed Perdition will buy the fish and become pregnant by touching the fish's head. After 3 months, she will give birth to the Antichrist. Like Sefer Zerubbabel's story of the birth of Armilos, the Greek Daniel Apocalypse's story of the birth of the Antichrist is clearly intended as a parody of the story of the birth of Jesus, in this case because the Antichrist is the evil counterpart of Christ. Sefer Zerubbabel, on the other hand, implies that Christ and Antichrist are really one and the same. Finally, I think I already said finally, but I'll say finally one more time. Finally, before I explore the development of the figure of Armilos in Jewish texts that postdate Sefer Zerubbabel, I want to note one further parallel between Sefer Zerubbabel and Christian accounts of the Antichrist, lists of the bizarre physical features of the eschatological enemy. Sefer Zerubbabel's list, according to the most important manuscript, runs as follows. This is the sign of Armilos. The hair of his head is the color gold, and he is also green to the soles of his feet. The width of his face is a span. His eyes are deep. He has 2 heads. The elements of the list vary somewhat among the manuscripts and the printed first edition, but all of the lists describe a creature of unnatural appearance. Another list, similar in its impact, though not in its details, appears in Sefer Eliyahu. Since such lists appear in Christian texts as far back as the 3rd century, it seems likely that Jews took over the form from Christians, who use it in a very similar way as this example from the Syriac Apocalypse of Daniel demonstrates. This is the Antichrist from the tribe of Levi. These are the signs and the awe-inspiring vision of his stature. His head is huge, his hair red, his eyes blue, and his neck strong. His sides are high, his chest broad, his arms long, and his fingers short. He has 2 horns next to his ears, and he has strong flesh in his ear, as well as lean flesh. His figure is wrathful, stupendous, and furious. The figure of his stature is likewise stupendous. Now, this list is one element of Christian speculation about the Antichrist that, at least as far as I can see, Jews adopted without any major need to adapt it for their own purposes. Okay. I'm going to leave Sefer Zerubbabel now. Sefer Zerubbabel's picture of Christian Rome as the final oppressive empire was out of date in most of the Middle East almost as soon as it was composed. Yet it is a remarkable fact that many Jewish apocalyptic texts written under Muslim rule continue to make use of Sefer Zerubbabel's eschatological scenario. I mean, you would have thought that the surest way to make your predictions go nowhere is to get it wrong in a space of very few years, and yet Sefer Zerubbabel does exactly that, and it has a really, I think, a very profound impact. It's not always clear whether these texts know Sefer Zerubbabel itself or simply traditions drawn from Sefer Zerubbabel, but either way, there is a significant body of Jewish eschatological writing from the Muslim world that insists on Rome as the last empire, envisioning the restoration of its rule before the coming of the end, and on Armilos, the embodiment of that empire, as the great eschatological enemy. The texts in question incorporate eschatological traditions from other sources as well, primarily rabbinic literature, and they do not take over every aspect of Sefer Zerubbabel's eschatological scenario. Thus, while the 2 Messiah schema of Sefer Zerubbabel is quite widespread, I mean, you can't really say that there's a kind of canonical Jewish messianic scenario in the Middle Ages, but this is certainly one of the main variants. I think that's fair to say. So the 2 Messiah scheme is widespread. Heftziba is notably absent from these texts. At one time, I understood this absence to reflect anxiety about a mother for the Jewish Messiah, but I've come to think it's more likely that Jews living in places where Muslim culture dominated were simply less interested in such a figure and therefore eliminated her from their narratives. And I should say, we don't have a huge amount of evidence from the West about the reception history of Sefer Zerubbabel other than manuscripts, but where Heftziba does appear, it's in the West where the Virgin remains a very important figure. And I think, there's not that much evidence. I don't want to push it too far. I think that may be significant. Anyway, this evidence for selectivity in adapting Sefer Zerubbabel's eschatology makes the continued interest in Armilos all the more impressive. That is, they were willing to let go of Heftziba, I think because they didn't really find her useful anymore. So why do they hold on to Armilos? Indeed, some of the later Jewish texts develop Armilos' story in ways that go beyond Sefer Zerubbabel's account. The developments I'd like to discuss appear in several works from the centuries after the Muslim conquest. The Prayer of Rabbi Simeon Bar Yochai and 3 interrelated texts that offer 10 signs of the end, and I'm very happy to have A.J. Berkovitz and Ari Lam here, who were participated in a seminar I taught where we talked about many of these texts, but I learned a lot from the participants in that seminar, and Ari wrote a great paper about these sign texts. So anyway, it's really good to have them here. The prayer of Rabbi Simeon probably dates to the time of the First Crusade, but it's deeply indebted to an earlier work attributed to Rabbi Simeon, Shimon Bar Yochai, The Secrets of Rabbi Simeon. Its account of history makes it clear that it was composed under Muslim rule, but before the rise of the Abbasid dynasty in 750. It is attested in a single manuscript. So I don't want to sound as if I want to be honest with you about the attestation of these texts. You'll see there's not a lot. Each of the 3 sign texts is found in 2 slightly different versions, attested by a single witness, manuscript or printed edition. Overall, the combination of big similarities and small differences among the witnesses suggests a fairly well-formed corpus of tradition in these sign texts that received a variety of formulations. Several of the texts mention the rise to power of the Muslims, and 2 are attested in fragments from the Cairo Geniza, which also points to provenance in the Muslim world. I guess it doesn't prove it, but it's suggestive. All of the texts just described contain an episode depicting the confrontation between Armilos and the Messiah, son of Joseph, of which the details vary slightly from text to text. I'm going to give you one version of it. The confrontation begins when Armilos arrives and announces himself as Messiah and God. He will come to the wicked Edomites. Edom is, of course, the homeland of Esau, who was identified in Jewish tradition with Rome, and thus from the 4th century on with Christianity. He will come to the wicked Edomites and say to them, I am the Messiah, I am your God. They will immediately believe him and elevate him over themselves as ruler, and all the descendants of Esau will join forces with him and come to him. Armilos then demands that the Edomites produce the Torah he has given them. They do so, and it apparently supports his claims. Next, Armilos summons Nehemiah and the people of Israel with their Torah and demands that they recognize him as God. Nehemiah and his companions refuse, citing the first 2 of the 10 commandments. I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me. Armilos dismisses the content of the Torah and again demands that Israel recognize him as God. Nehemiah instead denounces him. You are not God, but Satan. There follows a battle in which many of Armilos' followers die, but Nehemiah too is slain, together with many of his followers. Now remember, Sefer Zerubbabel never describes the encounter between Nehemiah and Armilos, except to note Nehemiah's death. And while it hints that Armilos regards himself as a god, and maybe hint is not quite strong enough, but it doesn't place much emphasis on it, it offers nothing like this explicit proclamation of divinity, which might be understood as modeled on 2 Thessalonians' prophecy of the lawless ones announcing himself as God, or better, on later Christian development of 2 Thessalonians' very brief narrative. For example, Pseudo-Ephraim's sermon, which we talked about earlier, reports the words of the evil one, what the figure calls the evil one, thus, I, even I, am the Father and the Son, the first and the last. There is no other God apart from me. Now, I think this is a distinctively Christian formulation of a claim to divinity, and I think it finds an echo in the Jewish text version, I am the Messiah, I am your God. I am the Father, I am the Son, I am the Messiah, I am your God. Now, there's no reason to believe that the Jewish text in which Armilos' claim to divinity is expressed so clearly knew Pseudo-Ephraim's sermon. I'm not trying to claim that. The dating of the text would make it possible, but there are certainly many other channels, written and oral, through which a Christian depiction of Antichrist proclaiming himself Father and Son could have reached Jews in the early centuries of Muslim rule. But whatever the channels, it seems clear that the prayer of Rabbi Simeon and the sign text are responding to such a depiction. The episode of Nehemiah's encounter with Armilos shows clearly that Rome retained its hold on the imagination of Jews living under Muslim rule generations or even centuries after the arrival of the new imperial power, professing a monotheism that also claimed Abraham as its father. The role Christianity, Christians, and Christ himself play in the prayer of Rabbi Simeon and the sign text demonstrates that for these texts, Christianity remains the most profound other of Judaism, the ultimate antagonists. It appears that some Christians share this sense of the particularly fraught relationship between Judaism and Christianity. Pseudo-Ephraim's sermon contains a detailed and poignant picture of the suffering of Christians at the hands of the Muslim invaders. Yet although Pseudo-Ephraim calls Ishmael, the ancestor of the Arabs, the herald of the son of destruction, when the Antichrist appears, Muslims are nowhere to be found, and it's the Jews who embrace him. Jews will take pride, the Jews will take pride in him, they will prepare themselves and come to him. But then this very strange thing happens after the Antichrist proclaims himself God, and I've read you that passage. 10,000 Jews will denounce him. They will answer him in truth, you are a deceiver for all creatures. For the one whom our ancestors restrained at the top of the wooden cross on Golgotha is the Redeemer of creatures, and he was raised up to the one who sent him. Ooh. Enraged by their response, the Antichrist orders these Jews to be slain. So After the initial positive response of the Jews to the Antichrist, his denunciation by these 10,000 Jews is a little surprising. And not only do these Jews testify to the true Christ, the one whom our ancestors restrained at the top of the wood on Golgotha, but they are martyred because of their testimony. It's possible that these 10,000, their behavior of these 10,000 is intended to highlight the evil of their ancestors and the obstinance of most of their contemporaries. I'm honestly not sure what to make of it. But if the precise interpretation of this aspect of Pseudo-Ephraim's picture is open to debate, I think one thing that is clear is the central role Jews play, for better or worse, in the events at the end. The makeup of the actual population of Jerusalem at the time of Pseudo-Ephraim's sermon could have encouraged a rethinking of inherited eschatology to give Muslims a more prominent place. But for Pseudo-Ephraim, at least, the new reality had only a limited impact on the old eschatology, perhaps for the same reason that the Jewish works just examined continued to view Rome and Christendom as the ultimate enemies. For at least some Christians, Jews were the other against whom they defined themselves. And given the crucial negative role Jews play in the canonical narrative of Jesus' career, I should say the crucial role period, and crucial negative roles as well, I think this is probably not surprising. I'd like to conclude by suggesting that continued focus on Christian Rome long after the arrival of Muslim rule in the Middle East, in the Near East, is not merely a peripheral phenomenon confined to the 4 not very well attested works I've just discussed, or to several additional works of somewhat limited circulation to which I could also point, though none of these others includes an episode that embodies the focus on Christian Rome quite as well as the ones I've discussed. Rather, I think it is a central aspect of Jewish eschatology. I want to make the case that it's a central aspect of Jewish eschatology in the centuries after the rise of Islam. And to do that, I want to turn to the Book of Beliefs and Opinions of Saadia ben Joseph, the greatest Jewish scholar in Muslim lands during the early Islamic era, who was active in the first half of the 10th century. Now, in Treatise 8 of his Book of Beliefs and Opinions, Saadia offers a systematic account of Jewish Messianism, and as befits the work of a legal authority who headed one of the rabbinic academies of his day, the treatise draws primarily on rabbinic tradition, and perhaps in response to Karaite criticism, it expends considerable effort to provide biblical proof texts for every element of the scenario it presents. But in addition to traditions drawn from rabbinic literature, it also includes traditions that first appear in Sefer Zerubbabel, though I'm less confident than some other scholars that Saadia knew Sefer Zerubbabel himself. It seems to me he could have learned of the traditions that have origins in Sefer Zerubbabel from the Secrets of Rabbi Simeon, which was written early in the Muslim era and was the point of departure for the prayer of Rabbi Simeon, or he could have learned it through texts we don't have anymore or through oral transmission. So I don't think he has to do what he does. I don't think he needs to have known Sefer Zerubbabel itself. Anyway, in keeping with his allegiance to the rabbinic corpus, Saadia attempts to integrate the traditions from the Sefer Zerubbabel into a framework provided by rabbinic tradition. Thus, he incorporates a Messiah, son of Joseph, who shares many features of the biography of Nehemiah ben Hushiel, though he does not give this Messiah a name. But he relates the expectation of the death of this Messiah to the rabbi's assertion that Israel must repent in order to be redeemed, and that if necessary, God will force repentance by bringing great troubles on Israel. This is a passage from the Bavli. Again, not surprising that Saadia would look there. In Saadia's formulation, the death of the Messiah, son of Joseph, will be the beginning of those troubles that will cause Israel to repent. Now, by Saadia's time, Jerusalem had been in Muslim hands for centuries, and Saadia himself lived his entire life in lands under Muslim rule. Yet, in Saadia's scenario, Jerusalem will have to return to Roman rule before the Messiah, son of Joseph, can appear, and Armilos will play his familiar part as conqueror of Jerusalem and slayer of the Messiah, son of Joseph, or at least as the one responsible for the events in which the Messiah meets his death. Even in the event that Israel is worthy, and thus according to Saadia there is no need for the Messiah, son of Joseph, and his death, Armilos continues to play a role, since one of the deeds of the Messiah, son of David, will be his slaying. So even when Saadia manages to avoid the Messiah, son of Joseph, he holds on to Armilos. Now, given the impact of Sefer Zerubbabel on later Jewish Messianism, I suspect that the expectation of the return of Roman rule to Jerusalem and the coming of Armilos were widespread among Jews who engaged in eschatological speculation after the Muslim conquest, even if we don't have a great deal of literary attestation. But once Saadia included these expectations in the Book of Beliefs and Opinions, they were vouched for by the greatest figure of the age. Saadia may well have shared the perception of the texts already discussed, that it was not Islam but Christianity that was the most profound antagonist of Jews and Judaism, but perhaps he also embraced the expectation of the return of Roman rule before the beginning of the Messianic era, precisely because it served to tamp down eschatological anticipation. Until the Romans conquered Jerusalem, there was no reason to get too excited. Such a motive would be another aspect of adapting traditions from Sefer Zerubbabel, which is certainly excited about the imminent end, in light of rabbinic traditions, which are far more cautious in their eschatology. But this is pure speculation on my part, and someone who knows more about Saadia than I may say it's completely wrong. What I can say, that's speculative. What I am going to say with some certainty, and with this I'll conclude, is that while one might have expected a figure whose career parodies that of the Christian Messiah and whose name identifies him as the embodiment of the Roman Empire to fall out of favor among Jews in the Islamic era Near East, given his lack of relevance to the world in which they lived, the inclusion of Armilos in Saadia's treatise on eschatology guaranteed him a long afterlife.
Thank you very much for a truly fascinating talk, which I think in many ways is a wonderful way to begin this workshop, suggestive and engaging and multifaceted as it is. If it has piqued your curiosity as much as mine, let me just make a plug for Professor Himmelfarb's latest book, the most recent of the six, which just was released by our library's cataloging department 2 or 3 days ago, entitled Jewish Messiahs in a Christian Empire, a history of the book of Zerubbabel, that has appeared, I think, in the last several months under the imprint of Harvard University Press. Would certainly serve as a very rewarding supplement to this fascinating talk. As I listened to what you're saying, to what you've said, all kinds of questions came to mind, and then you systematically answered one right after the other, which just made the talk particularly valuable for me. I would just wonder if it might be possible to fill out the Antichrist Armilos parallels a little more by considering that, which I think is something that really is implicit in what you've said, that the description of Armilos in Sefer Zerubbabel can be understood as a kind of collage of motifs, and not just one particular strain or tradition that he's adapted as opposed to others. The depiction of Armilos as the product of a union between Satan and a stone in the shape of a virgin. Actually, that fascinated me. What is the shape of a virgin? Is it the shape of the Virgin Mary? Okay.
I'm nodding because I think it's a great question. I don't know the answer. That's right.
if it were a shape of the Virgin Mary icon, but you're saying there really wasn't one in sculpture in this part of the world, certainly. So I was wondering what does the shape of a virgin look like? But the idea of Satan as the progenitor of Armilos, in some anti-Christological traditions, Satan is the father of Antichrist as well. Not in all, and then the issue of how is Antichrist descended from Dan emerges. So some people work that out and some writers don't. But I'm not so sure that in terms of the reception of those traditions, that contradiction would be particularly important. And another anti-Christological motif that might inform the appreciation of Armilos in Sefer Zerubbabel, perhaps, or I'd ask you if you think that it might, is the notion that we find in certain Christian writers that there actually will be two antichrists. There will be an antichrist who is essentially Neronic, who will arise from a kind of Roman milieu, and then there will be an Eastern antichrist who will be the real antichrist, who will come and follow the Neronic, more Roman antichrist. And as I was listening to you, and I haven't finished your book yet, but I've read part of it, but as I was listening to you and also reading about Armilos in Sefer Zerubbabel, it seemed to me that this collage of characteristics, or mélange of characteristics, might well reflect that kind of conflation of traditions. So thank you again for a suggestive, even a provocative, and a fascinating lecture. And people would really do well to read the book. I know that means somebody's going to recall it for me, perhaps earlier than I'd like, but I'll happily pay that price. The floor is now open for questions and comments, and maybe we'll take a few at a time and then give you a chance to respond to.
I want to. Okay. So first of all, thank you for this extremely rich paper, and I want to pick up on the stone worship. And we tend to claim that at this period we cannot talk, or at least be very cautious when talking about kind of religiosity as something that is independent of power, relationship, and politics, etc. And certainly, if we think about the book of Revelation, I don't think we can talk about paganism or anti-paganism as something that is separated from the polemic against Babylon, against the power. Here, however, there seemed to be a quite kind of explicit distinction between worshipping Armilos and worshipping the stone. The stone does not seem to have power. The stone is beautiful. So can we talk about, polemic against Rome and Christianity as Rome, as Byzantium, and an anti-Christian, meaning anti-Christian religion, forgive my French, polemic?
Yes.
Thank you for this fabulously enlightening paper or lecture. I was hoping that you could comment a little bit about something that seems slightly strange about Zerubbabel, namely that at least in the other, say, eschatological texts in which you place this as context, it seems quite common to have a king or a ruler of the past stand in for a king or ruler of the present day. And it's really only in Zerubbabel that you have a current regime depicted as an eschatological player. And so it seems at the same time strange that Rome's influence in this eschatological discourse continues into Muslim rule, but then it also, on the other hand, seems quite normal in sort of generically. So I was hoping you could comment on that.
Maybe we'll take one more and then ask Martha to respond. Okay? Oh, we have one more? Sorry. Go ahead.
This was so fascinating. Thank you so much. And I'm even though I was in the course, this was even more enriching. It occurred to me just in response to the question about sort of the shape, a stone in the shape of a maiden, that just as soon as I heard it,
a virgin. Right,
in the shape of a virgin. What occurred to me was just the language in Daniel 7 of Echad Kavarnash, one in the shape of a man, the son of a man. And given the sort of ubiquitous resonances of that text in all different forms of Messianism, which were certainly percolating here, and Daniel, of course, being an influence that you mentioned on this sort of Messianic discourse, I wonder if there's a sense in which, sort of, whereas in Daniel 7, the sort of the cosmic, the Messianic battle is fought sort of in the cosmic sphere with these different with these sort of different angelological or otherwise figures. The sort of progenitor of Armilos is just the stone in the shape of a virgin, but just the stone. So I wonder if it's sort of resonating with that Daniel text.
Let me try to address the stone questions. Jeremy had some interesting comments, and then Ari first. And I think probably a stone in the shape of a virgin means you know it's a virgin because it's in the shape of the virgin. I think that must be what it means. But there's some interesting, in some of the later texts, the texts I talked about, not all of them, but some of them, although they've jettisoned Hefzibah, they keep the stone. But some of them call the stone an Isha. She's in the shape of a woman, not in the shape of a virgin. And, there are two ways to read that. Either they don't anymore know what it means for her to be in the shape of a virgin, and they ask the same question, how do you know? But the other thing could just be that it could also be a kind of polemical move. And in some manuscripts that seem to have been written in Western Europe, there, or at least in one manuscript, there's a point where what is Betula in the Virgin in what I take to be the most important manuscript is there Isha, woman, and I think that probably is polemical there. So I don't know. So I'm not 100% sure what to do with any of this, and I think. Clearly, the figure of the Virgin, at least for the author of Sefer Zerubbabel, is really kind of mesmerizing, and he really is attracted to it, but he's also really uncomfortable with it. And then, the later, the afterlife of it, I think shows what, why the conflict gets played out, I think. So I don't really have an answer for either of you, but I think, just an observation or two there. And I also mentioned, Jeremy, that in that Syriac Daniel apocalypse that gives the Levitical genealogy, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this text. It's an amazing text. I highly recommend it. It's another text that seems to exist in only a single manuscript, although I understand from Matthias Henze, who translated it into English, that they found another manuscript that they think may be the same text. It's pre-Muslim invasion. It's hard to date. I'm relying on Matthias Henze's view of it and on his translation. I think you could read it that the Levitical figure is actually kind of the herald of the Antichrist, and that there are two kind of Antichrist figures there. So that would be interesting, and that would be, that would give you attestation in a place where, say, for Zerubbabel could have known it. But I don't feel comfortable, going farther than that. So Ishai, your comment about, the political and the religious. So Armilos is Rome, and the statue is the cult of, veneration of the Virgin. That's very nice. I mean, I'm not 100% sure it's necessary. That is, I don't know how much that's a distinction. I mean, the Virgin is, after all, the guardian of Constantinople. She's the, she takes over from the, the Tuche of the city. She's kind of, she embodies Constantinople. So I think, in a way, she's a political figure by then also. So I'm just not sure. And again, someone, a Byzantinist could respond better than I. Whether those can be untangled or not. So Mark, the thing is that when Daniel consigns the fourth beast to getting burned and the little horn, I mean, those are contemporary bad guys for Daniel. And for Revelation, Rome is, whether Nero is contemporary or whether that beast is Nero or not, I don't know. Nero might not be contemporary. It clearly depends on how you date Revelation. But I do think that one of the things that happens is the impact of Daniel and Revelation means that symbolism gets used again and again much later when it's no longer contemporary. But Sefer Zerubbabel and Sefer Eliyahu together, make the move of seeing, the Sasanian Empire and the Byzantine Empire as enemies. And I think they're actually, they don't. Sefer Zerubbabel certainly doesn't know it. They're kind of recovering, that early apocalyptic mode of operation there.
Yes.
I think you're not allowed to talk yet.
Thank you, Martha. I also found it very fascinating. And something that I kept coming back to in my mind relates both to the manuscripts, which will not surprise you for me, and then also the fact that we have so little of them. In a sense, what does that mean, right? It can mean multiple things, especially since your first comment about what it would mean to own a text like this and how dangerous that could be. But then also imagining what kind of reading situations you imagine for a text like this. And that's a very difficult question, of course, but sometimes there are hints in manuscripts, the way they are written, right? Do they have marginalia? How are they produced? So do you have any indication from that, and what kind of milieu we should situate that?
Okay. Regarding the house of Levi. So I wondered, why wouldn't you have connected it to a few traditions we know regarding Jesus, or the polemic over Jesus being from the house of David and Ishai, that we have Christian responses earlier in 2nd, 3rd, 4th century claiming that Mary is not of the house of David, neither, and Joseph, it doesn't matter because he's not his father, but she is from the house of Levi because she's relative of Elisheva. So would you have connected that?
I think it's quite possible. It's a very, as I said, it's a confusing passage, and I'm honestly not clear whether there was one figure or two figures there. But I mean, that's certainly that would be a good explanation for Levitical descent, certainly.
For me? With the microphone.
Thank you very much for this fascinating lecture. And it occurred to me, it's now, I think it's the women's league now, isn't it? It seems the men began and now the women start. In any case, when you spoke about the figure of Armilos, it occurred to me a comparison to Shir HaShirim, where both lovers are described by the limb after limb, and also accordingly the description of either God or Metatron in Shiur Koma, in the literature of Shiur Koma, it's also described similarly. And they either start with the feet and go up to the head, or vice versa. And after all, there are some connections between Zerubbabel and Shiur Koma literature. And for example, in one case, Metatron says, "I will fight you," or Michael says, "I will fight you, Armilos. I will be your enemy. I'll defeat you," and so forth. So they stand one against the other, and they're sort of like mirroring each other. So I thought that, maybe they were thinking of the figure of Metatron according to Shiur Koma, and the other one is a horrible mirroring of that figure.
Okay, shall I take those two questions? Great. So let me start with the second. It's a really interesting suggestion that it's a kind of negative Shiur Koma there. I think what I would want to do, though, since we do have these Christian descriptions attested as early as the 3rd century, now, some people think that there is Shiur Koma material attested very early also, if you think it's there in 2nd Enoch, maybe. I'm not so sure. I would have been inclined to a later, but your idea that it's a kind of inversion of some kind of positive mode, and even going back to Shir HaShirim, I really like that. I mean, as far as we can tell, I don't think Jews invented it, but maybe it's just that we don't have it attested there. It seemed, the earliest attestation is Christian, but I mean, it would certainly not be implausible for them to have used Shir HaShirim as a source, Song of Songs as a source also. So I think it's a really, really interesting possibility. And it's a, Shiur Koma sounds kind of weird to us, but everything is very big, but it's positive weird, right? This is negative weird, but there is a lot of bigness going on. So yeah, that's really interesting. So Anne-Marie asked this very interesting question about reading situations. So all I can say is, I guess there's a Geniza fragment that would get you back to maybe the 10th century for Sefer Zerubbabel. There is one text, the text I kept referring to, the manuscript I kept referring to as the most important manuscript. We can say something about that text, but we can't. I don't think it's helpful for understanding the production of Sefer Zerubbabel itself back in the 7th century. Sefer Zerubbabel appears in the manuscript of Sefer HaZichronot, the Book of Memory, which is this amazing collection put together in the 14th century, probably in the Rhineland, by a guy who even gives us his name. And he collects texts from all over, and he arranges them from some of them are rabbinic texts, some of them are kind of para-rabbinic texts, some of them are sort of apocryphal. They're just a bunch of a very weird and diverse group of texts that a Jew in the Rhineland had access to and didn't mind writing down, and he copies them. It's a very long manuscript also. I think it goes into 300 folios, which people who know about these things tell me is extraordinary. And Sefer Zerubbabel is in the, I guess, the 250s there. So he's getting toward the eschaton, but when he finishes, he starts at the beginning. Actually, starts with a calendar. Starts with a little introduction about himself. So it's an amazing piece. He did almost when he gets to the end. He then found more stuff he really liked, so he added that after the end. He did most of the copying. He seems to have had a son who helped him, who did a little bit of the copying, and he does have some notes in the margins. The only part I've looked at carefully is Sefer Zerubbabel, and there the marginal notes are different readings or corrections. They're not comments about his own view, but he does tell you a little bit at the beginning about his own desire to collect these things. So it's a fascinating document, and I think somebody who knows something about medieval Jewry. I mean, it's just very unexpected in the Rhine. I mean, to me anyway, in its location. But I don't think we can get back to, excuse me, Sefer Zerubbabel that way.
We have time for several more questions or comments. And then, yes,
thank you very much. I want to suggest some inner Jewish sources, roots for the stone. There is this verse in Jeremiah parodizing paganism, saying, Omer la'etz avi ata ve'la'even at yelidtini. He says to the wood, you're my father, and to the stone, you gave birth to me. And the rabbis also picked up on this verse in Deuteronomy. There is the pericope of the good-looking captive, and the husband has to give her a month to cry, to mourn her father and mother, and then the Tanaitic Midrash says that she really mourns idolatry because of this verse in Jeremiah. She doesn't cry for her mother, she cries for the stone she has to abandon. So it might have some maybe influence on the image of the stone as mother.
Thank you, Martha. It was an excellent paper. I wanted to follow up on the stone also. Another possible source that is clearly polemic against Jesus appears in the Talmud, in the Sotah, in the censored piece about when he became when he started his idolatry, he took up a stone, Zakaf Levinta, it says, and interestingly, I'm not sure that's something we could think about a later interpretation that might be a reference to Sefer Zerubbabel. In beginning of 14th century, you have a reading in Sefer HaPli'ah, in a Kabbalistic work, of this phrase about Jesus, saying what he did was not picking up a stone, but picking up Zakaf Labina, which becomes both in the Zohar and in that phrase, specific phrase, which mentions specifically Jesus in Sefer HaPli'ah, it becomes the mother. She becomes the worship of Avodat Elilim, and I could read you the short paragraph, but it sits both sits specifically on the sources against Jesus, and I think in Sefer HaPli'ah it's clearly against Mary, and that again, maybe even in the Zohar where you have a few references to Sefer Zerubbabel, you could find already some hints to at least that sort of reading already then. So that's...
First of all, Vera, thank you very much. That's great to know. And Jonathan, that's really... What is the date of Sefer HaPli'ah?
Beginning of 14th century, maybe, that's difficult to date.
As I'm sure you know, Heftzibah does make an appearance in the Zohar.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Yeah. The Sefer HaPli'ah has a lot of materials of the Zohar, and probably even materials that we don't know that the Zohar, I mean, pieces of the Zohar that we don't know about appear in Sefer HaPli'ah. And drashot about Zakaf Levinta, I think we could find even in the Zohar, but that's something I'm still working on.
It seems pretty clear that Sefer Zerubbabel was available in Western Europe. I don't know. I don't know starting exactly when, but probably for the Zohar. So it's really interesting. Thank you. Thanks to both of you.
First, thank you for a really wonderful lecture. I suspect you're going to disagree with my question, but I'll ask it anyway.
I disagree with the question.
Well, with the suggestion that's embedded in the question. I was so convinced by the end of your talk, especially with regards to the vitality of Christian motifs in Islamic contexts, that I'm wondering if Sefer Zerubbabel may actually date a little later. You began your talk with saying, we know that Sefer Zerubbabel is pre-Muslim because it doesn't show any awareness of Islam. I'm wondering if the rich vitality of preservation that you've mentioned actually could push Sefer Zerubbabel a little later than initially planned. And that I want to also take up as additional evidence, maybe the point that Mark was making earlier. When are direct names of kings mentioned in apocalyptic literature that are those actual kings, as opposed to mentions of kings' names that actually reigned earlier? So if Shiroi, for example, isn't actually, it mentions Shiroi, so if in apocalyptic language it's not actually Shiroi, it's some later king that we're designating with Shiroi. So I'm curious if both of these two pieces of data may conspire together to suggest that Sefer Zerubbabel is actually later. And if we do that, then we can open up the whole Ephraim thing. Anyways, that's the question.
Do you want to disagree with that?
Well, I do want to respond to it.
Go ahead.
But
Go ahead.
Okay, no? Okay.
Because our time is
Oh,
running
this is
out.
it? Okay, so let me try to respond to it. Thank you, it's very interesting. I honestly wouldn't have trouble moving Sefer Zerubbabel a bit later. Some of you may know that Hillel Newman has made a very strong argument for dating it earlier, not in the, what I would say is a scholarly consensus of the early part of the 7th century, but for a kind of, I guess, a first part of the 6th century date. And I mean, honestly, I think it fits better in the 7th century, and I think his argument, while has some good points, it's good to re-examine it, I'm not convinced by it. I really don't have a problem, I mean, for me, the reason it needs to stay later is I just don't think you get the figure of Mary, of the Virgin, operating early enough in the way she needs to get Sefer Zerubbabel. So I could live with a slightly later date. What I would want to say, and again, maybe this would have been a better way of responding to Mark, I mean, I think Shiroi may be part of the Vaticania ex eventu part of it. This has already happened. Shiroi has come, and now he's gone, and it appears as if he dies. It's not crystal clear in Sefer Zerubbabel. And now we're entering so he might be the last moment at which you could date things. So, I mean, for my purposes, it's fine, and I suppose for the first few years of Muslim rule, you might not really realize it was there to stay, but it strikes me as tricky to compose a work like this where you're all excited about events that have been kind of trumped by something else that happens. But I'm not, I don't think it should be totally foreclosed. It's certainly an interesting possibility. But we don't need them to know Pseudo-Ephraim. I mean, Pseudo-Ephraim is clearly drawing on earlier traditions, and an earlier pre-Islamic form of Pseudo-Ephraim could have circulated, who knows. So anyway, thank you.
Well, I think we've gotten off to a marvelous beginning, and thanks to Professor Himmelfarb, to all of you.